A very good afternoon, distinguished guests and speakers. Welcome to our Center for Liveable City lecture series. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rachel and I'll be your MC this afternoon. The CLC lecture series is a platform through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. Today, we are delighted to have with us Chris Fair, CEO and President of Resonance Consultancy, to share a keynote addressing how the ranking of performance and perception of cities can be defined by data through the lens of three key factors: livability, lovability, and prosperity. Without further ado, let's invite Chris to give his keynote. Chris, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So I'm here to lead off a discussion about livability of cities, which you're all very familiar with, but also talk about lovability and the role that lovability plays in shaping the prosperity of cities when it comes to attracting talent, visitors, and investment. So I'll talk to you a little bit about our upcoming report. We're going to share with you some of the research and the methodology that we're going to be diving into in a panel discussion. And then after that, I'll be sharing with you the rankings of our first ever Asia Pacific Best Cities report. So that'll come later on today. But first, we'll talk a little bit about our background and the approach and understanding that we've developed as we've studied and tried to look at, well, what are the factors that make a city successful in the 21st century? Just for perspective, my firm Resonance is a placemaking, place branding, and place marketing consultancy. So we think about how do we attract visitors? How do we attract talent? How do we attract investment, businesses to cities around the world? Our clients range from many different places. I'm based in Vancouver, Canada. We do a lot of work in North America, but also Europe and here in Asia as well. And the essential question, regardless of whether it's a country, a city, or a community that we've asked ourselves over the last 20 years is how do you measure the performance of one place versus another? And of course, there are many different indices out there, indexes, sources of data. And honestly, we found there was a gap. And as we did in our work and our practice as consultants, we had to create our own tool and our own product to think about how we could measure the performance of places. And the question when we think about what makes one place better than another or more successful depends on your point of view. Are you thinking about a city as a place to live? You might have one set of criteria that would come to mind of what's important to you if you were thinking about relocating to another city. If you're thinking about going on vacation, you might have a different set of criteria as you think about why you would choose one city over another as a place to visit. And of course, if you were starting a business, you might have some other factors that would come into play as you think about what's important to you. So we've been studying and looking at all three of these perspectives. And what we recognized, and started with the Best Cities research over a decade ago, was that we needed to take a more holistic approach to how we think about our cities, that we can't just look at them purely from a livability perspective or purely from an economic perspective, that we were seeing that there's overlapping factors with respect to the criteria that are important to talent in choosing a city, to visitors, and to businesses. And that led us to creating the Best Cities, world's Best Cities report a decade ago. So years of research had gone into it. It's been 10 years now. We released our 10th edition in London back in November. And the Best Cities approach and methodology now gets a lot of media articles. And the insights, though, that come from this are really what I'm here to share with you today, and hopefully some of the key learnings. I always tell people that the rankings are entertaining, but the real insights come from understanding the data within these particular rankings. So as we look at this model of trying to think about a 360-degree view to measure the performance of place, we looked at really there are three areas that we need to be evaluating. First is livability. The second is lovability, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. And the third, is prosperity. But of course, performance of cities, we've learned, is only one part of the equation. You can kind of think about this when you see those pictures of an iceberg, and there's a little bit that's above the surface of the water, and there's a huge mass of ice under the water. So the performance of a city shapes also the perception. And for our 10th edition last year, we started a partnership with Ipsos to now not only incorporate performance metrics on key criteria around livability, lovability, and prosperity, but to also incorporate perception metrics. So with Ipsos, in our World's Best Cities survey, we conducted a study in 30 countries around the world, over 20,000 households, and we asked them 3 very simple questions to start incorporating into our rankings. First, what 3 cities would you most like to live in if you could live anywhere? Second, what 3 cities would you most like to visit in the next 12 to 24 months? And third, what 3 cities do you think offer the best job opportunities? So we've now replicated this study here in the Asia-Pacific region and are incorporating this perception data into the rankings. And the contrast between the performance and perception is also telling and provides new insights as it relates to understanding a particular city. Some cities have very strong perception and lower performance. Other cities have strong performance and lower perception. And it's that misalignment we're trying to understand between performance and perception to help shape and advise cities. So first, let's talk briefly about livability and the factors that go into this. I think livability is well understood, particularly here in Singapore. It's a very, very livable city. And what we're trying to understand are the factors that we're including are very specific, not to what we deem to be important, but to those factors that we can show have a correlation with the size of prime age population in the city. And that prime age population is people 25 to 44 years old, which is what we're focused on as it relates to economic development. So one of the factors, air quality, if we think about that as a high-level measure for the environmental quality of a city, fairly obvious. Second thing we think about is healthcare, of looking at the relationship on the healthcare system. Third is heat stress, and this is a new factor that we've incorporated in for the Asia-Pacific rankings. As we think about climate change, what are the impacts and effects of growing temperatures in our cities going to be on the choices we make from a location perspective when it comes to choosing a city to visit, a city to live, or a city to do business? The fourth factor, housing. And there's a couple of different ways to look at housing. Housing can be from the cost of rents, and in this particular case, looking at the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in the city center, to then purchasing. And what's the ratio? Not the absolute price isn't so important, but what's the ratio of income to the average price of a apartment? Parks and recreation. And this is where we start to get interesting. What you've seen so far are statistical sources, quantitative measures, but here now we're looking also at qualitative measures. And we're mining user-generated data from sources like TripAdvisor to understand, well, how many recommended parks and outdoor activities are there in one city to another? The perception I mentioned, so for this particular study, looking at a survey of 7,000 plus households in 8 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, asking them simply, which cities would you most like to live in? And the 8th point here with respect to livability is sites and landmarks, also coming from TripAdvisor. And what's interesting about sites and landmarks is it's looking at neighborhoods, landmarks, icons within a particular city. So we can think about this as what's the strength of the urban fabric of one city versus another. And lastly, and this is a new indicator that we've added also as we think about climate change, is the tree cover. What percentage of a city is covered with green vegetation 16 feet or taller? I guess we should have put that in meters for Singapore. So that's our livability indices of thinking about a bucket of factors. And what you didn't see in there was things like safety, crime rates. For one, we're not able to show a strong correlation between location decisions at a metropolitan level when it comes to crime. Crime typically influences decisions much more once you've chosen a city into what part of the city you live in. So there's other factors that you might look at and say, well, why isn't this in there? Or why isn't that in there? And it could be because of data availability, but it most likely is because we're not able to demonstrate a relationship between that factor and the outcome that we're trying to measure, which is the growth of prime age population in a city. So let's talk about lovability. So lovability, we were talking earlier, I had a conversation, I think it was going back 7 years ago with Design Singapore, and Mark Wee here was doing some work around lovability, and he saw, hey, you're using the word lovability too. So we compared notes, and I think Singapore was really one of the first cities that I found in the world that was using this term we had coined, lovability. So obviously there's a few people thinking about it. What lovability really is speaks to the experiential quality of a city. But I think it's even much more than that. When you think about the word love, you love people, relationships in your life, whether they're family, friends. But the next thing you're most likely, when I ask you, well, where do you want to travel on your vacation? And you'll say, oh, I love this particular place. So lovability speaks to that emotional connection. And what causes that emotional connection? It's not the hardware of a place. It's not the infrastructure, the bridges, the roads. Of course, if they don't work, you might dislike that place. But what creates that emotional attachment, that connection that resonates with you in your mind and in your heart is the cultural experiences that you have within a city. So we look at different measures, and here we're getting into very non-traditional factors that we can demonstrate have very high correlations with attracting not only visitors, but talent to a cities. So we look at Instagram in both the domestic language and English to measure, well, how many posts, hashtags with your city are there in Instagram? We look at Facebook check-ins, which speaks to the stickiness of the city. How engaged are citizens and visitors as they experience your city? Google Trend Score. How is the search volume for your city going up 1 year over another? And then there are qualitative factors like museums as a measure for culture that we can look at. And again, we're going into TripAdvisor here for that particular measure. We can look at nightlife experiences, and we could do a whole talk on the nighttime economy and nightlife and the changing definition of that. People typically, when I say nightlife, you think nightclubs, but nightlife is so much more than that, right? So again, we go into TripAdvisor and you'll find that there's comedy clubs, there's arcades, there's all kinds of different experiences other than just bars and nightclubs that are considered part of nightlife. And nightlife not only has a strong correlation with attracting visitors and talent, but interestingly, it also shows strong correlations with business formation within a city, which is underappreciated in terms of the role the nighttime economy plays. So it's not saying that nightlife is causing businesses to form, but if you want a strong startup economy, you probably need to have a strong nighttime economy as well. Then we have our perception. As I mentioned, this question here was, which cities would you most like to visit in the next 12 to 24 months? Shopping experiences. Shopping's the most popular tourism activity. So we look at, again in TripAdvisor, how many different recommended shopping activities and experiences are there within a city that speaks to the retail vibrancy of a particular place. And then we look at the absolute number of TripAdvisor reviews, which is a reflection of the strength of the visitor economy and experience. So the third leg is if we think about livability, the lovability, of course we want prosperity for our cities. And prosperity is a function of both hardware and people. So we look at different factors here as it relates to infrastructure like airports, universities, but then also labor force participation, educational attainment, et cetera. So as I mentioned, airport connectivity, key from both a visitor attraction perspective, but also from a business formation and economic perspective. The airport connectivity is showing stronger and stronger relationships with the economic vibrancy and growth of urban economies. Average wages, as we think about in terms of how equitable an economy is. We look at Startup Blink's score for the business ecosystem, which measures a whole variety of different factors. So you can see here we're using other sources and indices, their overall rankings for city, to incorporate them as metrics within this holistic view that we're creating for these cities. Convention centers. Interestingly, we often think about convention centers as a tourism asset or part of driving the visitor economy, drives hotel occupancy, but we also see strong relationships between the size and strength of a convention center and business formation within a city. So we need to be thinking about convention centers not just as agents for the visitor economy, but also catalysts for economic development. GDP per capita is quite simple to understand as we think about the strength of the economy in terms of what's the economic output per capita. Fortune 500 headquarters, still, even as we think about remote work and all of the changes in the way we work and organize businesses, that large corporations still are showing strong relationships with attracting talent and business formation within cities. Labor force participation, I think that's one of the bigger changes over the last decade, as we've seen in many cities around the world, that we have workforce shortages. So what are the policies that have been put in place in a particular country or city that encourage labor force participation? And this can be many different types of social programs, childcare, et cetera, that are in place that help engender higher rates of labor force participation. Then perception, and the perception question, as I mentioned, was really asking participants in the survey of which cities do you believe have the best job opportunities, using that as a proxy for how people perceive the strength of one urban economy versus another. And then the unemployment rate, which is a statistical measure. So if we have the perception on where people think the job opportunities are, we can also look at the metrics from an unemployment perspective to understand, well, what is the quantitative measure for that? And then we also look at the strength of universities. So just wrapping up, I think I'll leave you with one particular piece that will lead us into the panel discussion, which is trying to understand, well, what is most important in determining the success of a city today? So after 10 years studying these factors, looking at over 1,000 different metrics in terms of trying to choose which measures we should include within the best cities rankings and reports, this is a very simple version of analysis of this back in 2019, where we looked at, well, what are the factors that have correlations with attracting prime age population, which we call talent? What are the factors that have strong correlation with attracting visitors? And what are the factors that have strong correlations with business formation? And you can see there's some that overlap with one another, some that were distinct, like hotels and convention center were important for visitors. Talent was looking, job opportunities, corporate headquarters, museums. Interestingly, in North America, professional sports teams are also show a high correlation with where talent was moving. You had businesses, venture capital, immigration, university ranking, health tech employment. Safety at that time was a factor that was actually more important for businesses than it was for talent attraction. There were some that overlapped with each other, and you could see culture was at the center or the heart of a factor that overlapped with all three of these areas. And often we thought about culture as really a nice to have. And I was making presentations in 2017, 2018, 19 around how culture was actually really a need to have, because culture really helped drive economic development as it related to talent attraction and business formation. And you can see that nightlife overlapped with talent and businesses. So in 2024, coming out of the pandemic, we wanted to update this and look at this. And this analysis is based on US cities. We've done it in Europe as well. We need to do that for Asia Pacific. But I think the conclusion would be the same. Look, what happened is that we saw this convergence between the factors that were somewhat overlapping and somewhat isolated between talent attraction and business formation and visitor attraction were now nearly one and the same. And I think this reflects, if you think about the shift and the change of our lives in terms of how we live, how we work, how we play, our cities don't look that much different, but the way we use them, the way we live, the way we play, the way we learn has changed. And the factors that are drawing visitors are correlated and now overlapping with, and it makes sense, because if you think about if you could live anywhere, thanks to remote work, et cetera, don't you want to live somewhere where a place that's vibrant, that has different activities? Often many of the things that you would have thought about when choosing a city for a vacation are now becoming factors that your talent are choosing in terms of a city to locate. And of course, businesses follow talent, so businesses are also landing and forming in places that have vibrant visitor economies. So we see that these forces that attract visitors are becoming, and talent and business formation are becoming increasingly aligned. The challenge we have now is that, one, our cities were designed for a different time, but the way we manage and plan them is also organized in a very siloed way. And I'll just pick on my city, Vancouver, where I'm from, but most cities look like this, where we have one organization doing economic development, another organization like a chamber or trade that represents the interests of local business. You have a city administration, and you have a DMO, or what's called a destination marketing organization. And these all have different brands, they all have different stories, they all have different messages, and they all have different plans. And our challenge moving forward really for us as we think about what does this convergence really mean is how do we create more livable, lovable, and prosperous cities? Well, we need to have greater alignment between the organizations and administrations and the agencies within our urban ecosystem in order to make this happen. And I'm looking forward to discussing this in more detail, with our panel that we'll jump into here in a moment. And then later on be sharing with you some of the results of this study for the Asia Pacific Best Cities Rankings. So with that, well, back to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the very insightful keynote. I would now like to invite Executive Director for Centre for Liveable City, Hugh Lim, and Managing Director of WRLDCTY Private Limited, Anupam Yog, to join Chris Fair and on stage to sign the Memorandum of Understanding. This MOU, a first between Centre for Livable Cities and WRLDCTY, will focus on knowledge exchange and collaboration, as well as bring Resonance WRLDCTY conference into future editions of the WRLDCTY Summit. Thank you, Hugh, Chris, and Anupam. May I also invite Executive Fellow CLC Michael Cole to join them on stage for a photo, please. Thank you, Hugh, Michael, Chris, and Anupam. Today's lecture will be moderated by Ms. Ong Ker-Shing. Ker-Shing is no stranger in making places livable and lovable. A designer, educator, director of Lacquer Architects, and associate professor in practice at the National University of Singapore. Ker-Shing works to advance interdisciplinary approaches in inclusive design and to establish Singapore as a leader in this emerging field. It's now our pleasure to invite our moderator, Ker-Shing, on stage, together with our esteemed panel of speakers. Sebastian Tan, founder of Mamatiam, Lo Shang, Synthesis, and Amacha. Theresa Sheils, Regional Managing Principal, Gensher. Chris Fair, CEO and President of Resonance Consultancy. Dr Limin, Director of Research, Centre for Liveable Cities. And Anupam Yog, Managing Partner of XDG Labs. Ker-Shing, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, so my name is Ong Ker-Shing and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. We will now hear from another 4 distinguished speakers who will flesh out ideas about how the city is more than just its physical, functional, and material spaces, but that what makes a city livable and lovable is more than what it looks like, how thoughtfully planned it is, or how well maintained the street trees are. It is also about the individual lives, the social relationships, and the emotional connections enabled. And that together, these provide a rich, living, and ever-evolving tapestry that, despite its complexities, necessitates study and quantifying, or if you'll allow me to insert a made-up word here, requires qualitifying. In the 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale, the Singapore Pavilion, When is Enough Enough? The performance of measurement, in which I participated, probed this drive to measurement with the curatorial question, in building the city we love, how do we measure the unmeasurable? It was deliberately provocative. Like, why do we always need to describe, analyze, and measure? Do some intangibles defy measurement? What becomes lost in translation? It did not argue, however, that we should not be at least trying to measure some things. It was just asking us to think about what we distill into markers and metrics, and then the connection between these words and numbers and their meaning in the lived experiences of the city. So as we listen to the sharings this afternoon, I would urge particularly those in practice to mull upon the interface between what is designed, planned, and managed, and built, and what is perceived and felt, which will of course vary from city to city, but also very much even within a single city, depending on the individual person's socioeconomic status, cultural background, life stages, and as Chris just mentioned, point of view. Appreciating the complexities of this fluid interrelationship will take us beyond an understanding and appreciation of our cities and into a projective, constructive mode of engaging with and influencing our built environment for the better. So Chris has already given us some examples of what intangibles make up the performance measurements in Resonance's Place Power Score, and that allow us to assess the desirability of a city. From our next speakers, we will hear more about the importance of these measurements, and how they might help with understanding how some of the intangible elements can then help to shape the environments that we inhabit. After the sharings, we will have a panel discussion with all 5 speakers, and then hopefully at the end, if time permits, we will be able to open up to the floor for anyone who has burning questions. So without further ado, I'm just going to quickly introduce all 4 speakers and then prompt them to go in turn. So first we have Dr. Limin Hee, Director of Research for Singapore CLC, which is a nexus and knowledge center for livable and sustainable cities. So Limin focuses on research strategies, content development, and international collaborations. Under her leadership, CLC Research spearheads forward-looking studies that consider how cities can prepare for the future and thrive in the face of driving forces such as resource shifts, the push for net zero cities, aging societies, and new ways of live, work, play. So Limin will speak on understanding livability and balancing key outcomes. Next, Theresa Sheils will speak on the role of planning, urban design, and architecture in creating livable spaces. Theresa is the co-regional managing principal of Gensler's Asia Pacific and Middle East region. Previously, she spent 28 years in Gensler's Washington, D.C. office, working on some of the firm's most complex international architecture and interior design projects. She's known for being a strategic advisor, leading client and consultant teams in tackling the challenges facing our cities across the globe. Theresa is a proponent of sustainable design and is adept at developing high-performance design solutions that use leading technology to reduce energy use and mitigate negative effects on the environment. We will then have Sebastian Ang speaking about the role of food culture and lifestyle amenities in the life of the city. And this is Sebastian's first public sharing, so I hope we give him a lot of support. Sebastian is the visionary entrepreneur behind Mama Tiam, Lo Shang, Synthesis, and Amacha, 4 unique concepts blending Singapore's heritage with modern design experiences. Through his ventures, Sebastian reimagines the softer aspects of city living, fostering community, nostalgia, and cultural appreciation. Dedicated to creating lovable spaces, he integrates food, ambiance, and hospitality to elevate urban culture, and his work showcases the importance of preserving traditions while innovating for contemporary audiences, making cities more vibrant and livable through meaningful F&B experiences. And last but not least, Anupam Yog will reorient us back to the importance of measuring livability. Anupam is a researcher and creative strategist. At XDG Labs, his research and advocacy is focused on healthy habitats and the development of a conscious cities index, which explores the connection between community well-being and a city's urban design. Anupam is founder and director of Mixed, correct? An urban innovation and placemaking studio and managing director of WRLDCTY, as you know, Global Forum for Urban Innovation. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers, and we will start with Limin.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, and thank you, Ker-Shing, for setting the context for today's panel. At the Center for Livable Cities, of course, livability is at the heart of our research. So what makes a city desirable? And of course, Chris has shared a lot about what makes cities livable and lovable. And according to livability indices like the Resonance World's Best Cities, cities like London, New York, and Paris rank high due to their good connectivity, strong business ecosystems, and iconic tourist attractions. But what about us here in Singapore? From our research, many people appreciate our lush green spaces, accessible public transport, and thriving central business districts. We also value our conserved heritage buildings, iconic landmarks, and delicious and affordable hawker centers. These are just a few examples, and livability continues to be a broad and evolving concept. Given today's challenges for cities, CLC has developed a livability framework that proposes a balanced understanding of livability outcomes for cities, a competitive economy, sustainable environment, and high quality of life. The framework also introduces a collaborative ecosystem as a supportive system, highlighting that government alone cannot achieve livability on its own. It requires collective stewardship and strong international partnerships to facilitate transformative collaborations. When we track our progress in achieving livability, we typically focus on output indicators that measure the deliverables of an intervention. However, to understand the effectiveness of these interventions, we should also look at the outcome indicators that measure their impacts. Livability encompasses both tangible factors and subjective experiences. Measuring both tangible and intangible elements provides a holistic view of livability. Tangible aspects can be quantified by outcome indicators like air quality and outdoor temperature, while intangible aspects measured by indicators like cultural vibrancy and sense of community reflect residents' overall thoughts and capture impacts on the human experience. These aspects are often interconnected. For instance, public spaces can foster a greater sense of community, leading to increased socialization and contributing to wellness. Understanding and quantifying livability requires a nuanced approach. A truly livable city excels not only in numbers, but in the quality of life and experiences it offers its people. Our challenge is to measure and nurture both types of outcomes, creating cities that are vibrant, resilient, and sustainable. Before I end my sharing, I'd like to share this diagram from Professor Den Hill from the Melbourne School of Design. It illustrates how aspects of livability are connected. Urban interventions can lead to a wide range of interconnected effects, impacting biodiversity, commerce, and the social fabric. These effects often manifest around us daily, but are rarely measured due to the lack of data. To address these data gaps, we can leverage the science of cities methodologies to map out the complex systems in our urban environment and identify factors to be measured. Our ability to understand and enhance livability in our cities lie in recognizing this complexity and balancing inevitable trade-offs. The livability framework I mentioned earlier helps us to imagine how we need to balance outcomes of a livable city. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion later.
Great. So I really I loved this quote. What I loved about it is that in a lot of the environments we create, technology is invisible, but we also have to acknowledge how it lives with nature. And one of the things I think is most important about the environments that we create is not only how we create them with nature, but also the nature we've already created. Meaning, we've already put something there, and how do we perhaps restore it or make it regenerative, in addition to just growing urban fabric. And what we've found through our City Pulse, which is a survey throughout many cities, similar to Chris's, is that during the pandemic, there was sort of this flight from cities. And the pinch points and the pain points were really what that was. And we did another survey during 2023, and what we found was people were coming back to the cities, but the pinch points were still there. And so how do we continue to make people drawn to the city, but also address these pain points? And what we understood from these pain points is that they really focused around two elements: cost and affordability. And really looking at these issues and targeting them in the specificity of them, we looked at neighborhood design, and that is around the relative adjacencies, but also the ease of access. This problems of big cities, the ideas that they are noisy and crowded and big, those are also some of the things that make them great, but they're also some of the pain points. And then lastly, this idea of affordability. And so beyond those pain points, we need to recognize that while cities are growing, they are also accelerating climate change and really contributing heavily to the system's collapse. So I think the question and challenge for us all becomes, how do we design for all living systems, not just humans, to create resilient and regenerative cities? And I wanted to quickly share an example of a study that we did in Vietnam. And we used the Saigon River as a catalyst for this master plan that really took the opportunity to define the relationship between land and water on a large scale in Ho Chi Minh City. What we wanted to do was really improve the quality of life, reconnect the people to the site, the climate, the history, and again, this idea of technology. The goal was to respect nature and reduce our impact through the construction process. We also wanted to employ strategies to address the challenges of urbanization, climate change, and rising waters, resource depletion, and Chris, you touched on this, happiness, and things like happiness, which are actually very measurable. And then while we were looking at connectivity and walkability and flexibility and diversity of paths and street widths and vitality, we knew that we had to integrate seamlessly technologies to enhance traffic patterns, to make it safer, to include wayfinding. How do we address pollution? And also waste management. And this is really what I mean, and what I think that first quote from the theorist really talks about, is how do we seamlessly integrate technology and nature into the environments we've already created, and acknowledge that we've created a new nature, and how do we reconnect these to each other in a more meaningful way. Thanks.
Thank you, Theresa. Hi, everyone. My name is Sebastian Ang. It's my first time here today, so cut me some slack. Right? So I'm actually the F&B entrepreneur behind 4 very unique brands. And across all my concepts, I always make it a point to blend dining experiences with Singapore's heritage culture. So since today we are going to talk about how livable a city is. Often when we talk about how livable a city is, we always focus on the infrastructure, the economy, the safety. But what exactly makes a city feels like home? So for me, it's actually the experiences that we create, the restaurants that we bring our families and friends to, the cultural spaces that foster community. So in the next 5 minutes or so, I will start to share my opinion on how hospitality, food culture helps to shape a city's livability. So just now when we mentioned about the infrastructure, the hard aspects, right, the tangible aspects of economy and social. I think one thing that I like to pay attention to is that people make up the space, right? And in my opinion, I feel that food is something that we have to eat every day, right? And apart from just filling our stomachs and providing convenience, food is actually the soul of the city, the soul of the city, yeah. And Singapore has a very rich hawker culture, which is recognized by the UNESCO. And why is it recognized by the UNESCO is because I believe it brings a very unique culture and social experience. Whenever I have friends coming over from overseas, I'll bring them to Tiong Bahru Market, Bedok 85, and they're always very intrigued by the variety of food that they can get at the hawker center. They're always very, they look forward to coming back to hawker centers, and it's actually a very good sign. So lifestyle spaces like cafes, gyms, bars, they also provide a space for people to interact and unwind. So if I would like to continue, I would like to just mention that when we invest in these aspects, we not only make a city livable, but we also make it lovable. Now, let's talk about how these experiences are shifting post-pandemic. As a business owner point of view, I feel that this rapid change is inevitable, and especially with the millennials and the Gen Zs. So millennials and Gen Zs now, they focus on a more experiential dining, or what we call immersive dining experience, where storytelling comes in place, where there's a bit of cultural heritage, and there's also an increase in cafes that coexist like co-working spaces, right? And there are some bars that even integrate wellness into their offerings. So I managed to experience this firsthand at one of my establishments, Synthesis at Suntec City. So Synthesis is a TCM-inspired restaurant and bar. So in one collaboration with a local TCM clinic, we actually invited the physician over. We created a wellness menu, and we actually had physicians on site to give pulse reading, tongue reading to the customers. And they loved it. It was really a very special experience over 2 months. And we see an increase in millennials, Gen Zs paying more attention to wellness in a different way. So I feel that for cities to remain attractive and competitive, we have to adapt to these changing urban experiences. So now, city rankings. So on my own research, right, I found that a lot of city rankings, they often focus at the tangible aspects. And to me, do all the tangible aspects like infrastructure, safety, and economy makes the city vibrant? But not exactly, right? I feel that a lot of rankings, they tend to overlook the softer aspects, like the food culture and the lifestyle, most traditional ones, right? And for example, Singapore, we actually rank very highly in safety and efficiency. But there's always discussions around as to whether we offer enough cultural vibrancy beyond our structured environment. So I believe in the heart of it all, culture and food plays a very important part. And that actually creates the connection and belongings that shape the whole city. So I feel that livability is not really about function, right? It's about the emotions, about the people, it's about whether we are happy or not. And a truly livable city should focus on the quality of the experiences that it provides. And lastly, so what's next, right? I feel that a balance of infrastructure, culture, and experience is a key. But as business owners, as city planners, and cultural leaders, we have the responsibility to share our environments, not just for efficiency, but also for enjoyment. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So, I mean, after that, I'm not sure what's left to say. So it's a tough one. But let me share a story. I was just in Perth with my 15-year-old daughter, and we landed and started to walk towards, we got off the plane, and we started to walk towards the exit, and there were, I think, 2 or 3 people ahead of us. And there was an open door, but there was also a turn to the left going up the stairs. And for whatever reason, a few of the people decided not to go through the open door and just turned left and started walking up the stairs. And there was some confusing signage. And I just decided to stop and observe what happens, because it was pretty clear to go through the exit. And about 100 people followed before someone reached upstairs and realized it was a dead end, and they were supposed to walk through the open door. There was a lift, and people eventually found their way back. And so I suppose my question to myself has been, largely because of the pandemic, are we really following the right metrics, or are we missing a trick? And do we need to be updating our thinking, because cities are not static, they're becoming more complex. We all know the numbers. Everything's going to become urban, 2080, we're going to be a planet of cities, etc. But we're not in 2080, we're in 2025. And we've just gone through an event of, I hope, a century, and not something that's going to happen to us again. So I suppose the important thing is, are we asking the right questions? And we began, some of us who've been doing this research on conscious cities, with these questions. What is the purpose of our existence? How are we spending our time? And how are we expending our energy? There's a ton of great research already on other things, but we felt that maybe it's time to go back to the basics and really ponder these important questions. And these are some of the paradigms that we've been challenging: production versus consumption. How is our culture being oriented if we're consuming more than we're producing, and often producing stuff that we may not even need? What about attachment to place? I do love the word lovability, but I've wondered if we should first talk about likability before you love someone, you learn to like them. Nourishing versus depleting, a question I often ask. You might be feeling really depleted at this event. I hope you're not. I'm feeling very nourished, but some of you might not be feeling as nourished. So I think the idea of what is the content we're consuming, how are we feeling about the content the city is producing, and are we really feeling nourished at the end of the day? Lovability versus livability. The city is, after all, a collection of places. So what are the precincts, the districts, the neighborhoods where we spend most of our time? How are they making us feel? And to me, the most infinite resource is nature, culture, and community. And this is not about architecture. This is not about the tangible things, but really how we feel in a place, the kind of people we interact with. So to me, the key question, we've been doing this research for about 5 years, the Conscious Cities Index, and I think it boiled down to one thing. And it was really with this one insight, that places that are screaming for more, what if you start doing less? This is actually a great experiment right around the corner at Raffles Place, where they just put a bunch of chairs above the raised lawn in Raffles Place, because nobody used to walk on the lawn because they thought they couldn't. So the place manager said, why don't we just place some chairs and invite people to sit? And it's been a great experiment going on for a few years now. So this was the key conclusion we've reached halfway in a 10-year research program. What if a city began focusing more on being than doing? It's not undermining the doing, but really have we lost our sight about the being versus the doing? So constant activity versus stillness and rest, success, not just quantitative, but the qualitative idea of success, which could mean different things to different people. Outcome-oriented versus experience-oriented, and I couldn't have said it better than Sebastian, so congratulations on your debut. I think you floored everyone. Observing, the value of a pause and learning to observe before we react. So what if we started to respond rather than react? And this sort of idea of perpetuation versus pause. So mindfulness has been a modality we've been exploring, through which we are exploring what a conscious city might be. We started an experiment called the Big Sit in the neighborhood right here. But I just wanted to leave you with these thoughts as we ponder about what do we measure next. And this is just a video I'm going to end with, because I often feel that we've, perhaps like the airport in Perth, maybe we should have just gone out through that exit. So we do need to find our way back somehow to the basics. And that's what I would leave you with. And this video would perhaps give us some inspiration.
Don't do the right thing. God knows you'll be tempted. The right thing sounds so good in meetings. It looks fantastic in charts. The right thing soothes racing pulses and settles churning stomachs. Everybody can get on board with the right thing. The right thing is good enough. But good enough is not enough. Don't do it. Don't do the right thing. Avoid it like the plague. So what are you supposed to do? The wrong thing? Of course not. Do the brave thing. The thing that troubles your sleep. The thing with a million unknowns. That seems ridiculous one moment and genius the next. That's the thing you should do. Chase it down. Don't let it go. Do the thing that disrupts, that upends, that doesn't just defy the status quo, but reshapes it forever. You can do that. You have that in you. To do the right thing or not is a choice. To disrupt or not is a choice. Let's do the brave thing.
So that's just an invitation for all of us in Singapore, because I think we've reached a point in this city where we really need to come up with our own version of what is next. So an invitation to do the brave thing. Thank you.
Amazingly, there was so much to say with each of you only having 5 minutes, and yet we're ahead of time. So I'm incredibly impressed. So I suppose it's the moderator's privilege to start with the questions. And then after I've exhausted my list, then I will open up to the floor. But as we're talking, please, I invite you to think about anything you might want to ask. And we will try and pass mics around in about half an hour. So thank you all very much. Very insightful, but also kind of inspiring probings this afternoon. I have some questions first to start for all of you. And this is a bit of a challenge because it's for you to kind of summarize what you said in 5 minutes, yet further, maybe, into 1 or 2 sentences. And then afterwards, some specific questions for some of you. So my first question, and Sebastian, I'm staring at you because you are staring back at me there, so you can start. So in 1 or 2 sentences, can you speak about what will be the future of urban livability or lovability? Or perhaps you can think of it as how cities will be perceived in the future.
Right. So, in my opinion, right, the future is made up of people. And I feel that moving forward, when how we want the city to be will be how the people shape the city. And in my personal opinion, I feel that hybrid concepts such as co-working spaces, there'll be an increase because there'll be people who wants to work in a different environment. Restaurants, there will be more storytelling, more immersive experiences. There will be a rise in how I think people will change the way they value life in a different direction. Right. So this is my point of view.
Power to the people. And I would just imagine that you used a lot of commas to make 2 sentences. I'm teasing. Theresa.
I think it's interesting. I think we need to make sure that cities are adaptable. technology is going to be ever changing. If you think of all the buildings that we tear down or the streets that we move to grow a city, I think we need to say, can we transform them with what's existing? Can we bring nature and technology and the cities that exist into what needs to happen for the changing future and the changing future's needs? And I think the other thing I would say is, and I mentioned it before, our cities need to be regenerative. We can't just plow through nature. We can't just rip up the nature we created. We need to make whatever we add or change continuing to connect to nature.
What was the short version of the question? In terms of the future of cities? Or
Yeah, what is the future for cities, the way that people think of cities?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time talking about lovability for the last 20 years, advocating for the experiential quality of cities, and couldn't agree with Sebastian more on the importance of that. I fear now, though, that we're moving into a time where resiliency and the future-proofing of cities becomes more of an imperative. We're working in the city of Los Angeles right now on a tourism plan, which very much is about the vibrancy, the qualitative aspect of the city. Of course, that doesn't matter when there's fires and thousands of homes burning and population displaced. So quickly now, the vibrancy, the lovability of the city is being put on the back burner as we learn to deal with this exogenous threat as a result of climate change, that we are now going to have to invest more in hardware, policies, systems to adapt to the reality that we've created. So that's a bit of a pendulum swing, if you will. I hope that the advocacy and focus around the lovability of cities isn't lost as we move into this new era of climate adaptation to the reality that we've created.
Thank you.
For me, I think two ideas here. One is about balancing. So we know that livability makes a city function well, but livability is what creates that special emotional connection with cities. As such, cities that can balance infrastructure, economic and human potential development needs, at the same time fostering culture and a sense of community, will stand out. And secondly, I was very inspired by that diagram you showed where pre-pandemic, what were important, and then there was this shift as to post-pandemic. A whole lot of other things seem to feature as very important. So I think cities need to be agile and be able to adapt to changing perceptions and needs. So balance and agility would be my contribution.
So I think if I were to look at what's happening right now in terms of the shifts in people's behaviors, which will inform, I think, choices. I actually think the future of the city is rural, because we seem to have recognized that there's a serious disconnection in the way the city is conceived right now. It's actually causing us to fall more sick. And there is a movement, certainly when I look at generations of younger people and the kind of what's drawing them, is actually trying to produce the rural within the urban. So I actually think there's a very, very structural shift towards, by the end of this decade, we will already see very different manifestations of neighborhoods than what we're used to seeing, which is the materiality of place is going to shift, the way we engage with each other. I think the office is already shifted in the way we have known it. So I think it's going to be more rural.
It's the age of Aquarius, right? Power to the people, everything is being sort of turned back. Yeah, it's very, very, very interesting times we live in. Thank you. My next question is actually for Chris and Limin. In recent years, especially after the pandemic, as you have pointed out in some of your talks, we saw shifts in what people value in urban life. So how are changing lifestyle preferences reshaping the concept of essential urban amenities? And how can these evolving priorities or trends be leveraged to create more distinctive places?
I don't know so much if it was a shift as a reprioritization. So a lot of the elements that we look at are the same, but what we're prioritizing has maybe is what it's shifted. And where that shifting to tends to be more suited to suburban or exurban locations. So, if we looked at the last sort of 20 years pre-pandemic, there was a drive to the city center in terms of the cultural vibrancy, restaurants, nightlife, et cetera. But now I value space, I value time, I value green space, outdoor recreation, which is not in the city center. And so now it's much more about the urbanization of the suburbs. So in many cities, we've kind of, because that reprioritization is kind of turning the city inside out, or the adaptation of that. So where that leads to and how we find that balance now of restoring the desirability of the city centers is a challenge for many clients in many cities that we work with. And I don't necessarily have the answer for that today, but I think there will be the result of thinking about how we make our city centers less monopurpose and much more, not just mixed use, but mixed life as it relates to time of day, types of uses, types of users, and that will require a whole rethink in terms of how we've zoned and planned many of our city centers.
Yeah, and what you said, post-pandemic, we are also seeing a growing demand for exercise, recreation, and being close to nature, especially here in Singapore. And we also see that cities like Barcelona are reclaiming streets for pedestrians and greenery and creating human-centric spaces. Vienna's new Pier 22 project offers public spaces for work and leisure, catering to those who can work from anywhere. And in many of these projects, we see that community participation is key. Also seen in Singapore's Business Improvement Districts pilot program, which enhances precinct vibrancy through private sector collaboration. And for instance, the pilot BID at the Singapore River hosts frequent events that celebrate the riverside charm. And I'm sure later Anupam will share a lot more about some of these, because I just read his thesis that said a lot about business improvement districts.
Well, thank you. So that segues really well into the next question. And also, I mean, Chris, your point about city centers needing a dual life. I mean, I think this is Sebastian's, some of the your F&B concepts do exactly this, right? So this question is for Sebastian and Anupam. In what ways can cities better incorporate fun aspects, such as arts, culture, kind of community? I mean, Anupam, you talked a lot about kind of community, kind of slowing down, or other kinds of innovative recreational or pause spaces to enhance the urban experiences while still balancing the need for the city to function.
Right. So I think that in order for us to integrate culture, food into our daily lives, that is something that will probably bring the whole overall experience together. So I recently went to this place called New Baru at River Valley. So New Baru used to be a school, and I think a F&B group took over. It's not my group, yeah. F&B group took over, and then they made it into a very, very different space. So I went to the school hall, and there was a pop-up market. So such places in Singapore are hard to come by, and by integrating arts, culture, food into our daily lives, even just a weekend, it brings a different kind of experience. So I think the fun part about F&B is that there's a lot of creativity space. And I think the key is to be flexible, how to transform somewhere familiar into something new, but still working with the space we have. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you for that question. I wonder if Michael planted that question, because I know he's a serious champion of fun. But I think, and this is, I would say, a cultural phenomena, and it's generational, that we largely, I mean, if we look at the makeup of our society, somehow we've just, we use that phrase, the new normal, after the pandemic. Fun needs to be normalized. We've forgotten how to have fun. So just like we schedule meetings, maybe you need to schedule time for fun. Because you need to train yourself with these behaviors. And fun I used in its widest sense. I mean, rest and renewal is fun, right? Because if you're burnt out, then I'm not sure how much fun you can have. We talked about the nighttime economy. I actually think we need to reclaim the mornings. I mean, we live in it's a fairly hot city most of the time, but the mornings are beautiful. So an idea that we are working on, extending the big sit into a festival, where we are thinking of, the breakfast economy. Because this is an expensive city. So unfortunately, as many new ventures Sebastian starts, there are unfortunately 100 more that are failing. So we've got to figure out how to create a flexible system. So I would add one ability to the livability and lovability that we really need is to be open about vulnerability. Like, can we come out and talk about failure and say, okay, try again, right? Make failure cheap and non-stigmatic and just keep going on, because we do need many more entrepreneurs like Sebastian, and make it easy to start and fail and start again. So I would say that's the way to have fun.
Life lessons today. I like it. Theresa, urban spaces today need to be both functional and flexible. What are the key challenges you've encountered in designing urban environments to be able to adapt to these rapid technological advancements, evolving work patterns, shifting lifestyle preferences, and of course, issues of climate change?
I think it's interesting. A lot of times we want to solve a problem, right? And so the knee-jerk is, what's the problem? How do I solve the problem? And I think we don't always pause and think about the long term, at the other end of the problem, what's that solution result in? And I'll give an example of a city that needs, because I was just in one, that needed to have better public transportation. So they created a rail system. Well, great, we've got this rail system that runs for miles, but it only goes one way. It only goes in one direction, and there's only one line. And once you get off at a stop, you're darting across traffic to get to the end. And so you've created a rail system that gets from point A to point B, but it's not being utilized. It's not being utilized because people aren't thinking about what's the actual problem. How do I get not just on a rail that goes in one direction, but how do I get, when I get off, how do I get to the next spot I'm going to, sheltered from the heat, or not being a road runner trying to, dodge traffic. And I think, we've looked at through our city pulse, using that as another example, different cities' relationships with rail. And, what we've found is the ones that are successful address concerns of safety, like why aren't people using them? They're old, or they don't feel safe, or they're not accessible to everyone. And so if you think of the fact that they had a problem with rail and they solved the problem, that's the problem of rail, but it's not the solution for the need. And so I think really understanding what we're really solving for, but knowing that what we think we're solving for is going to change in the future. No one, I think, thought about what office would feel like or what work would feel like in 2019. And you could never have imagined that, right? So that adaptability and that what if is really important, to be able to not just say, oh, I've created this many square meter floor plate, which is great for office. Well, maybe it's not great in 2020. Or I've created a rail and it goes from one point to another, but it doesn't solve anyone's problem except the guy who lives at this end and works at this end. So that's what I would say is not just the knee-jerk reaction to solution solving, but really thinking about what's the ultimate outcome that we're trying to actually solve for.
Thank you. And perhaps we can talk a little bit more along those lines in the final question, which is really kind of projecting forward how we can advance the way that we think about designing and improving our cities. But just quickly to go back to this idea about measurements, this is a question for everybody. And it has to do with what we've all been saying, which is about needing to balance tangible and intangible, quantifiable and unquantifiable. Indices usually rely heavily on quantifiable metrics. And although, was it Theresa who said that happiness can absolutely be measured, yet, sometimes the intangible factors are hard to measure. So we're seeing novel indicators like the latte index for purchasing power parity. How can we balance the need for quantifiable outcomes with the less tangible aspects of livability and lovability? Limin, maybe because you keep saying we need to balance, maybe you can tell us how we can balance.
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, we do capture tangible indicators, but I feel, through the work that we have been doing and observing, even tangible indicators vary across cities because things that are important and measured in one city may not always be measured in other cities, and then as such is not captured. So I think better ways of even measuring quantitative indicators are necessary. And when we talk about using social media to capture some of the intangible and day-to-day experience, I feel there's a need also to take a cultural perspective, because even the kind of social medias that are used and popular in different cities, they vary, and in terms of languages used, that also varies. And if we only troll certain kinds of social media that captures, say, perceptions of the English-speaking world, we are actually missing out a lot of thoughts and perceptions of people who do not use English language. But I see that today with AI that is able to access different languages, that might change, and we may need to rely on AI in a way to tap on all these voices that are, across different kinds of social media that can help us get a better view than if we just rely on maybe the English-speaking media. So that's a thought that I have.
Let me respond to that?
Yeah.
So there's no question that a key critique of any index is there's always a bias built in. So certainly ours has a Western bias using English media sources. And I think part of that is just trying to get comparable data. And that's where I find actually the more insightful rankings or reports are more localized and focused. So of course we're all fixated by comparing ourselves, rankings, trying to understand the world at a global level. I like to describe our rankings as catnip for journalists. They just love to eat it up. It's very consumable, but it's actually not very insightful. And I think what we try to do and evolve in some of our work as a consulting practice is understand within a city what's important to those residents and that community, and let's benchmark them based on what they value, because the values are different from one city, community, one culture to the next. So I don't want to put myself out of the rankings business as it relates to our best cities reports, but we do try and address that in our consulting practice with cities and communities by understanding what's important to that particular region, community, and benchmarking them against the criteria that they've determined important to them as a community.
Thank you. I guess I should have clarified all along which hat you should be wearing when answering these questions.
Many hats.
Many hats, yeah.
All with biases. Arguing with one another.
Absolutely. Anupam?
So I'm wearing a T-shirt. Let me say, it says the struggle is real. So it is real because I think we've, I'm all for. I went to the University of Chicago, which loves data, and it also has this phrase where fun goes to die. That's our motto. So I've been in that school, and I can assure you, yes, that is where fun goes to die. I've also had the privilege of going to the University of Oxford in the social sciences, where I was just literally finished. Limin has read my thesis, which has still not been marked, so I don't even know what's going to happen. But it's a very different perspective, and I think we need both. We need both, but I do think that when we talk about how we feel, it is easy to measure. Are you feeling well? Yes or no? It's measurable. Sometimes I think we may be demanding more of ourselves than we need to, and we need to be comfortable with this is enough. To your art, where was it?
Architecture Biennale.
In Architecture
Yeah.
Biennale. I do think that depth is important, so maybe actually getting better at measuring what we already do know how to measure and making it more comparable, adding more cities to our data sets. I think the value of observatories needs to be understood, that just observation and then over time learning to just measure and get more skilled at observation is something that we do need to do. So I think there's a lot of noise at the moment, and I feel fewer variables, fewer indicators, but getting them right and getting them well is really important. And the qualitative stuff, I really value the Best Cities Index, which I know Chris and I got to know each other actually 11 years ago at the launch of the Best Cities Index in New York. And I really think it's a very hard index to produce because it tries to capture the richness of so many variables. But what I really love about our index is the fact that we've added this perception factor. So it's performance and perception, and that's life. It's imperfect. So I think that's getting comfortable with this idea and not beating ourselves up over getting 10 on 10, and then keep trying. Right? I mean, there's the value of going again and trying again.
Theresa.
I think we've all sort of echoed similar thoughts. I think one of the things that's most important in trying to quantify, and there's so many things we can quantify, is making sure you have a broad range of touch points. So what may be great for men may not be great for women. What may be great for people 20 to 40 may not be great for senior folks. Whether it's transportation or walkability or what's happening at night. And I also think we talk about livability of cities, but Limin, you were just talking about the social media, right? And it made me think of I was going to Kyoto for an extra day after being in our Tokyo office for work, and I grabbed a tour guide for a couple of hours, and I said, "Oh, have you heard of this restaurant? It sounds like it's really good." And she goes, "Oh my," I said, "It's dumplings." She goes, "Oh my God, don't tell me it's so-and-so dumplings." I said, "Oh, that was what it was." And she goes, somehow that caught on with some American woman on Instagram, and now it's full of tourists, so just don't go there. But I mean, if you looked in the window and you looked at the line, you'd think, yes, this is I've hit the gold mine, right? But so I think it's all those different touch points that, and like everyone was saying, the local, but also every demographic, because they're going to vary, and you're going to have to, in order for it to be livable and lovable, it has to be livable and lovable for everybody that exists there.
Sebastian, can you close it out? Have you answered this already? You haven't.
No, haven't.
Yeah.
No, I'm not. Okay. Okay, from a personal note, I think a lot of times I often ask myself, am I happy? Because if I'm not happy, it'll be difficult for my guys to be happy. If my guys are not happy, their families will not be happy. So the answer to this question is yes, I'm happy. I look forward to work every day, even though work is very, very tough. But why am I exactly happy? It's because I am doing the things that I feel is right. And the things that I feel is right, although they may seem tough, but at the end of the day, when I look back, I feel that this sense of achievement is something that I probably will not get elsewhere. So from a mini point of view, how to quantify the balance, right, is really about you knowing yourself what you want and whether you are moving towards the direction. And for every individual out there, even to my staff, I just did appraisal this morning. I questioned him, 1 year down the road. It's been a year. Where do you see yourself in next year? What do you want to achieve? Let me help you with that. So by helping individual, by reaching their goal in a small way or another, I feel that this makes the city more balanced. Yeah, thank you.
So you're doing the brave thing, right?
No, I'm doing the necessary things. Yeah.
Which are brave. Okay, so the last question for everybody, and then we're going to open to the floor, has to do with, what all designers are obsessed with, which is about what can we actually do, right? I mean, thinking wherever optimists, thinking projectively about what we can do. And I mean, Sebastian, you're not excluded, not Anupam, because you're not kind of, design driven or design trained. It's really to think about, based on your own expertise, your own points of view, what is one either kind of key paradigm changing idea or a paradigm embodying person? Like, what kind of person do you need to be to help advance the way that we design our cities to be more livable, lovable, etc.? Yeah. Theresa, maybe, because you've kind of answered it at the beginning.
What did I say?
Agile,
was it good?
I mean, it was a cry for kind of an ethical stance, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, I think our first answer is to design for humans because that's who we are, right? But we have to design for the technology we're creating. We have to design for the nature we already have created, the nature that exists, and we basically have to design for all the elements that are going to be part of what's there and what will be there, because what we're creating is for a very long time, and I think we're seeing what happens when we create and destroy through climate change and ecosystem collapses, and we really need to start looking at how do we create with what's there and transform as opposed to destroy.
that was great.
I guess as I think about sort of paradigm shifting would be, from a planning perspective, have we overthought cities to some degree in terms of zoning, policies, regulations, that maybe we've outsmarted ourselves into creating circumstances and an environment that will lead to cities in a future that we don't want? And do we actually have to look back at how we can create more flexibility within policy and planning? Because we don't know what the future holds. And I look at a city like Houston, for example, which we would not necessarily hold in high regard from a planning perspective. No zoning, so a city was built for cars. But that's what the city and the people at the time demanded, and it met those particular needs. So could Houston be more flexible and adaptable to create the city of the future? Because it's not regulated or prescribed, and the flexibility is there to have that transformation. So as much as I kind of criticize that particular city, and it's a place that we work, I actually think it's a city that maybe is one of the best platforms for the future, because it can create what the future needs based on adapting and evolving circumstances, not 100 years of how we've done things before.
I'm an architect too, but I'll speak kind of more broadly about design in terms of how we design policy and planning and so on. And I mentioned earlier that cities should shift from output-based measuring systems to outcome-based measuring systems. instead of only measuring direct impacts, we should link policies and planning to broader societal outcomes like health, well-being, sustainability, and social value. Actually, which is what architects do too, right? Right. So, and the transition will not be easy and will take time. This requires conversations with diverse groups of people and stakeholders, residents, to understand their concerns and what they deem to be important in their cities in order to reflect a broad spectrum of desired outcomes. And despite the steep learning curve, because shifting from one way of measuring, right, from outputs and supply-based side thinking to outcomes and demand-side thinking, requires a steep learning curve. But having this mindset change will allow us to truly understand residents' perceptions and make more informed decisions in building livable and lovable cities. So maybe to me, this is the brave thing to do.
My answer is inspired by you, so I'm going to read it out because I'll forget to misquote this very beautiful quote. But I think for me, the paradigm shift is really, well, let me read the quote first. Now and then, it's good to pause in our pursuit of happiness and just be happy. So if you ponder that for a moment, now and then, it's good to pause in our pursuit of happiness and just be happy. And I think that's actually paradigm shifting, because a lot of people are really unhappy in their pursuit of happiness. And that's kind of sad. So to me, I think what would happen if we started producing, making, engaging, exchanging, when as a community we are truly happy, everyone's happy. And I think there are examples of that. I went to Bhutan, I think 15 years ago. I couldn't have predicted that 15 years later they're going to be building a mindfulness city. I'm curious about that. I'll hold space for it, and I truly hope that they're able to translate what is in the air in Bhutan, because everybody's truly happy there. So it's not, maybe they started with fake it till you make it, but gross national happiness is a real thing in Bhutan. So I think when I look at Singapore, I've only been 11 years here, so I can't say I'm an insider, but I guess I'm not really an outsider anymore. So I have this interesting in-between space. And I obviously this is home. My 15-year-old daughter has certainly grown up here, so she spent most of her life here. And I love her perspective when she goes out, she travels quite a lot, and when she comes back home, there's always a sense of, I'm so happy I live in Singapore, because there's a sense of, I think it's partly to do with Singapore Airlines and Changi Airport, which has cracked the psychology of de-stress. But it's true. So there are some great examples of, just being happy, being in the moment, and then trying to create some magic, because magic does only get created when you're truly in the moment.
You've run out. Okay, no problem. Can I invite questions from the floor? Yes.
Yeah, I actually don't like mics. I don't like technology. I've got lots of questions, and that I should actually pay credit to the speakers for their provocative ideas that they have shared. But so I've got to prioritize and limit it to 2 questions. Difficult. The first one, the topic is, what makes cities livable, lovable, and prosperous? Which seem to indicate that those are our desirables. That's what all cities aim to be. I question that. So my question would be, can a city be livable and prosperous, but not lovable? Can a city be lovable, but not livable, nor prosperous? I can't think of some, actually, but I won't share them with you. So the second question is, people make a city. It's the whole thing is city. And so how do you actually measure people's friendliness? Because a whole city can be so great to be in if the residents are friendly. So that's the second question. And just my last thought on paradigm shift. We keep saying that cities, we build it for people. I'm going to turn it around. Nature is important for people. We cannot survive without nature. Should we build cities for nature, biodiversity? Because then it would make it into a perfect city because we need nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there any one person that you wanted to direct any one of the questions to? Just to keep it, anyone?
Well, I'll take a stab at the first one.
Yes.
As in terms of, absolutely there are cities that are livable and prosperous that are not lovable. I live in one. It's called Vancouver. It's something that we struggle with as a city in terms of the experiential quality, culture, vibrancy. We're very distracted with the natural outdoors and the natural environment we have, that we don't spend a lot of time as it relates to culture, nightlife, culinary, et cetera. So it's an area that we have to work on. And vice versa, there are other cities, for example, in our Asia report, we'll look at places in India, whether that's Mumbai or Delhi, that are very lovable and tons of experiential qualities, but are not very livable. So this is, I think, finding that balancing act between livability, lovability, and prosperity is a lot of what we're analyzing within the rankings, and the ones that are at the top tend to be the ones that perform the best across all three areas. But to your other question, are those the only metrics that we should be judging ourselves and our cities by? I think that's a choice that each city and community has to make in terms of what's important to them. Those are metrics, broad metrics, performance-based metrics, and outcomes to measure, but not necessarily qualitative as it relates to what a community wants. It may be a city in nature that a community wants to be, and that's more important for those residents, and that's something that would require different criteria and different measures.
While you were asking those questions, I thought of New York City. And especially it made me start thinking about when you said friendly. I don't necessarily think New York City is friendly. Or I guess I wouldn't say, people would say, oh my God, New Yorkers are the friendliest people on earth. I also think there's a lot of people that don't think New York City would be livable, right? They might come from LA or Miami, right? And so I think livable and lovable becomes very personal. I think people have been in different cities and talk about the different cities they have lived in, and there's going to be one that they think is more livable and more lovable, and like you were saying, they're not all always conjoined. But I do think it's a very personal thing, what draws you to a city. And I think, and I'll go back to New York, I've never lived there and I never would want to, but I love it. I love visiting there. But what I love about New Yorkers is that they love complaining about New York. But they love it and they would never leave it. And if you wanted, and how expensive it is and how far it is to commute from Harlem to the financial district, but you're not going to get one of them to move to Hoboken, New Jersey or Greenwich, Connecticut. So I do think those factors all have to play into what makes the city, but that's its inhabitants, right, that are measuring it, and that's what's getting measured is the inhabitants.
It's funny you say that about New York. I feel the same way about Singapore. I'll never leave, but I'd love to complain about it.
Yeah, when I moved here, people were like, oh my God, it's so hot there. I said, exactly.
Right, just to touch on a bit about the friendliness, right? So when you mentioned about friendliness, it relates a bit to hospitality in my context. So I do agree that, when I go to New York, and the hospitality that we get at the restaurants over there are totally different. The kind of warmth, the kind of experience that we get at the restaurants there is nowhere compared to Singapore restaurants, right? And I've often asked myself why, and it really is the culture. Nowadays, when I stay in a HDB, you rarely see neighbors greeting each other anymore. Even a smile on your face, even a good morning when you go to the lift, you rarely have that anymore. And when I do it, it seems like I'm the odd one out. So this morning, I was going to work, I come down the lift, there's this uncle next to me, say, hey, good morning, uncle. He looked at me. He thought it was, So it's the culture, that makes people no longer that friendly as it used to be. But if we try to take a first step and be different, I feel in one way or another, it will definitely increase the friendliness around the neighborhood. So yeah, just coming from a small part of me. Yep.
Can I make a small comment about that? I think this friendliness thing, it depends. I mean, I had the same experience as you. I mean, when I went to shop and I said, please and thank you, and the shop girl asked me, you're not from Singapore, right? And I said, no. And so people are not used to, but I think that's okay, because to me, that is the level of friendliness most people are comfortable with. I actually feel very uncomfortable if, someone keeps asking me, how are you doing? Are you enjoying your meal? Just leave me alone. I can, right? So I think it's cultural. Agree with you, but and I think it's like how people are comfortable with that level of friendliness. So as that comes back to the point where. I think, Chris, you mentioned maybe cities should measure what is important to them. And I go back to Lina's question about, is this nightlife thing so important to, cities, right? I mean, I think it depends, and it depends on individuals. So I think at some point, cities might decide that they want to measure what's important to them, and through engaging citizens and how people feel and what exactly is important that you want to track over time, right? So I think that could be one thing that cities can think about.
We have. Do you want to answer this?
Only if you allow me.
Please go ahead. Please, no. Go ahead. Go ahead. I just want to make sure the second question is also answered, and then we have one more.
Well, very quickly, because I just wanted to cite an example of what we started doing in the pandemic, and it's still continuing, the big sit, where we gather and physically sit for an hour. And we're going through a mindfulness session, so there are parts of the session where we close our eyes. And I had some foreign visitors, and it was difficult for them to imagine that, and it doesn't matter where they were from, but what matters is that this perception that you could physically sit in a public place and close your eyes was unreal. So, one is being friendly, the other is how many unfriendlies might be there as well. So I think there's some value in, cities are mostly scary places. That's unfortunately the reality. They're just too complex, too big, built on fear. So that's what's actually growing the fastest, is fear in cities. And therefore, I think it's quite important to value, one, of course, this idea that I think there's another challenge of loneliness in cities, but that's a topic for another day. But I generally think public spaces in cities, it's very rare today that you can actually feel safe in them, and we're fortunate to have that as quite commonplace in Singapore. You could go anywhere in 3 a.m. and you'll be safe.
Absolutely. I mean, our children, I don't know about your daughter, but mine need special training when we go to another city. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, because they're trusting.
They
and
are.
I would not trade the fact that at 15 you'd rather trust than be afraid.
Yeah. I just want to make sure the second question is answered about whether we should design for our cities for nature. Maybe, will you do it, Theresa? Because you talked about...
I can just say yes.
Okay, yes. Yes, we should. Okay,
yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean...
Theresa.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to get at. We've already created the nature. And now we have to reinstate the nature that already existed before we created the nature that we have. So it's this combination of combining the nature we've created with what is actually existing. So if you think of all the cities that have put, or all the places that have put beachfront property because it's beautiful and gorgeous, and now all the beachfront is eroding or getting flooded. Well, we have to acknowledge the nature that exists and design to what is existing so that it can co-live with us and there's not destruction, right? So that is designing for nature as well as what we've created.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Ron. I've been in Singapore 34 years and I'm now a citizen. So thank you for all that you've contributed. It seems to me that a lot of what you were presenting and talking about is what the city can do, whether it's through regulation or it's through investment. And so you're doing city design, you're building infrastructure. It seems to have this sense of, build it and they will come, or build it and they will participate in it, and that will help shape the feeling and the culture and the experience of being in the city. I'm wondering, what is it that the city could be calling upon people to be more creative and generative and participate in, not just because we built it for you, now come on over and use it, but rather what are we calling for the citizens to participate in, or the residents? We have 5 million people. That's a lot of people who could generate a lot of ideas and behaviors and actions. But I understand it's got to be done the right way. Like, imagine if Singapore said, do the brave thing. Like the city said that to 5 million people. I'm not sure that would go down very well. It's too provocative. It's too evocative of what the city can't necessarily control. Or if they said, imagine the city of Singapore saying, take a moment to pause and be happy. It's not very productive. And Singapore's entire culture is focused on this persistent pursuit of greater productivity. So I'm just curious, from your point of view, especially when you say something like fear and loneliness are the rising factors in cities, can a city call upon its population to participate in a way where they're the ones thinking up, what is this new behavior? What new idea? What new actions can I, as a contributor to my city, bring forth?
Passed on to me by as if like.
Put you in the hot seat. Oh, no problem.
What was the question?
We've had buses that drive by with saying kindness campaign.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean that's an example of a city making an effort to say, hey people, come on, stop being jerks to each other. But out of, you guys are right now, and you're seeing what cities all over the world are doing. I've seen, for example, in the Brussels campaign, when you were working on place marketing, yeah? And you're saying, well, I mean, maybe you could tell us about it. Like, it was the city calling upon the people to behave a different way. Not
So
just
may
we're
I
gonna build a
clarify,
physical environment.
when you say the city, do you mean the government, or do you mean citizens, or are you calling out a particular stakeholder?
I'm looking more at city government.
Oh,
the
so
ability
you
to
okay, got
communicate,
it.
the tourism, the local, etc.
Yeah. So one of the questions that in the research we've placed for ourselves in the conscious cities is, what if we reimagine the city as a collection of nudges that facilitate a kind of social behavior that's different? In the trains, I was in London last year, and I saw that most people were not on their phones and were reading, which was quite nice. And Transport for London actually has been running persistently a campaign on poetry on the tube. So I don't think those two, there is some correlation. I mean, there are larger issues, and I'm sure Chris can probably get the data and see if there's correlation or not. But, in Singapore, unfortunately, you go into any train, 9 out of 10 people are going to be on their phone. So I do think that the city, as you refer to it, does have a responsibility on behalf of society to certainly take on, I think, health in however you describe it as a factor to improve. And I think that's what the city does in situations where it has taken that responsibility. I don't know if I answered your question, but I'd love to have a chat offline, and I think Chris will probably be able to answer it better.
I mean, a couple thoughts. I mean, I think a lot of, when asking, well, what does the city ask its people to do? I don't think it's so much asking as creating platforms and opportunity. I'll give you, one example of a city that we've worked with is Christchurch in New Zealand. Their positioning, as we did all of the analysis, was really being a more family-friendly city. And long story short, the idea was being a playground for people. And the city created an official day of play that engaged citizens to come up with activities, experiences, and of course they're investing in placemaking, but it's not the city's job to do everything. It was to create the platform and the opportunity for citizens to come up with ideas of what does it mean to be a city of play, and what are you going to do on the day of play within our city. So I think it's that kind of creative thinking and opportunities. You mentioned the work that we've been doing in Brussels. Surprised you've seen that in this part of the world, but thanks for looking at that. And long story short, our work in Brussels was really about defining positioning and learning that people think Brussels is boring. So how do we really, what is Brussels? Well, Brussels is not a leader in A, B, C, or D. It's the capital of Europe. That equals boring in many people's mind, but what we kind of uncovered was, well, really what Brussels are independent thinkers. And how do we create an invitation and communication of not to be the best at this or that, but actually daring people to be themselves and be individualists, and then creating programming and opportunity, and we're working on that now. So I think part of it is understanding what does the city and the community want to be, and then creating the platforms and opportunities for citizens to participate in and create programming that's authentic to them.
Thank you. Do you have one? Sorry, we only have time for one quick question. Yes, do you want to take it? Yes. Or ask it, rather.
Thank you so much. Hi, thank you so much for the very nourishing sharings. I think, yeah, I'm just so inspired by what you're doing. And I'll just introduce myself. My name is Joni. I'm actually my question comes from a point of view of both industry and research, because I'm working in LTA. I'm a station architect, and I'm also doing my research in how stations have evolved from purely functional to urban social spaces. And I'm particularly interested in also metrics, right? Like how we actually measure these social spatial performances of station. So my question really is in deciphering complexity, right? And also this paradigm shift that we all talk about. How do we see actually matrix and frameworks, are they enough to disrupt the status quo, especially the perception of decision makers in making change, especially, thriving in an environment where hierarchy and red tapes are just so much. So because this is my pain point in the, and also my interest, because in the work that I do as a station architect, I observe this change in the how stations have evolved. And in my research, I'm trying to look at the matrix, because I think as much as I'm trying to preach this in my workspace, it doesn't get through because people are ingrained with what they are doing. And when I talk to more senior, say architects, for example, they say, I've been doing this for 30 years. Is there something wrong with what I'm doing? Our station's not doing well. So when we talk about the intangible side of things, that's why I'm trying to look at the matrix, right? So really, I think my point of question is, are matrix and framework enough to disrupt and make that change? Yeah, in environments which are very, very heavily red taped on. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyone in particular you want to answer?
No, I think it's just open to the ground. Thank you.
Maybe we can invite two people to answer. Limin?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think it's something I'm very interested in, because in my past life I studied public spaces, and I'm really interested in how to make better public spaces. But here I think I want to go back to my point about, because you asked about metrics, right? And a lot of times we are very used to measuring supply side metrics, right? I mean, how much floor area of public space I allow, how many trees I plant, how many seats I put, right? But how do we shift that towards outcome based? So what's the outcome you want in, say, a transit station? Do you really want to move people quickly, or do you actually want to create social spaces? And if you want to create social spaces, how do you measure that impact, of social spaces? So here is where we are thinking through this problem to come up with parameters that can measure outcomes-based, metrics for future livability. And what we think is that this involves, it's not easy, it's not straightforward. That's why it's not been done, right? So, there's a lot of probably understanding, going through research, talking to people, that's necessary. But I think with the post-pandemic, there has been some changes. So, like, for example, we know that some districts in London are measuring, like, how many trips are actually, like, how many trips within a certain district, how much amenities must we provide to, say, have 60% of trips within a neighborhood? No, there's no need to travel out of that, right? So this is our observation, that new measures are coming in that will facilitate ideas like 15-minute cities and well-being and health, especially with societies that are aging. So I think I'm very inspired to see that people like you working on difficult, complex problems like this and enthusiastic and want to find solutions. So my take is, please come talk to us. We do want to involve you in our research and see where we can take this further to shift that mindset towards outcomes-based measurements.
I just want to chime in real quick. I think you should look at retailers. The things that retailers are doing around the journey experience for every single person that walks through their door. They travel the path, they understand how many elements they pick up, they understand how long somebody sits at a location. Are they interacting with the mannequins? Are they staying in the back? Is there no one going to the back? And they map that thing out, and they make changes all the time based on the user experience. And there's so many of these points along the retailer's space that it is allowing them to understand why they're stopping, what they're touching, what's the hot spots, what's the pinch points, why isn't this corner working? Is it the lighting? Is it the width of the aisles? Is it the merchandise? Of all the measurements and people measuring, retailers are at the forefront.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we need to move on, but I really appreciate that there are more questions in the audience, and maybe during the networking afterwards, you can approach the individual speakers to talk about more. So just really quickly, I want to thank the audience for staying here and listening and participating in this conversation, and to our speakers for really insightful afternoon. I think it's a good sign of a sharing session when you leave with more questions than answers. It means that you've been provoked to think. And I appreciate that we've today discussed everything from the very kind of mundane and practical to the aspirational. And it's been a pleasure chatting with all of you today. I think we need to now take some photos, and then you will have your QR code for your CPD points. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ker-Shing and esteemed panelists, for the very insightful and thought-provoking discussion. All right, now we'd like to present a small token of appreciation to everyone on stage. Could we invite Executive Director for the Center for Livable City, Hugh Lim, on stage to present the token of appreciation. All right, we'll now pass the time to WRLDCTY, who will be sharing something very special with us today. Chris, please.
All right. So I think this is the last segment, and you're probably tired of hearing me talk already, so we'll go through this relatively quickly. So we talked a lot about what we measure, how to measure it. Today I'm going to share with you the first release of our first Asia Pacific Best Cities report, and just show you a little bit of the data that we've collected. Hopefully this will provoke some conversations, and we'll continue that over as we talk about the networking time. So we're looking at metropolitan areas in the Asia Pacific region of 1 million plus, just from a data perspective. As I mentioned earlier, Ipsos conducted a specific survey in 8 countries to look at what cities were perceived to be the most desirable cities to live in, the most desirable cities to visit, and where they thought the best job opportunities were. We talked earlier, I explained the methodology for livability. As we look at all of these cities in the region, these were the results in terms of our benchmarking. Those metrics that I shared with you, whether it's air quality, whether it was housing affordability, whether it was healthcare, etc. You can see Tokyo at the top of the list. And in fact, many Japanese cities top this list based on those empirical metrics that we use to measure livability. But when you asked in the survey what cities most people wanted to live in, Singapore was by far and away number 1. not just obviously in Singapore, but as you surveyed households in all of these different countries. And then you can still see some of the other cities. But many of the cities, the metrics that perform the best aren't necessarily perceived as the most desirable places. And this is what's interesting as we talk about performance versus perception and where they're aligned and where they're not. So based on those metrics, 50% for the performance metrics, 50% based on perception, this is how we derived our overall score for livability of cities in the Asia Pacific region. So Tokyo is number 1, even though Singapore wasn't number 1, or in the top 10 on performance metrics, the strength of the perception and the desirability of Singapore pushes it up to number 2. Now, lovability, we talked a lot about in terms of the experiential quality of the city. I talked about the metrics that we use. Many of them are user-generated, whether they came from Instagram, Facebook. We talked about museums, nightlife, different experiential qualities. Here again, you can see from a performance perspective that Tokyo is number 1, Bangkok number 2, and Singapore comes in number 3. And many of these cities are some of the largest cities in the region, of course, so they offer the largest quantity of experiences, the largest number of visitors, etc. But when you ask on perception, you get a slightly different list in terms of these are the cities, the top 10 cities that households in the Asia Pacific region told us they most wanted to visit in the next 12 to 24 months. Again, you can see Singapore actually is at the top of that list, followed by Tokyo and Seoul. When we put those combined again together, 50% performance, 50% perception, Tokyo just best Singapore a little bit. Singapore comes in number 2, followed by Bangkok, Hong Kong, Seoul, and you work your way on down the list. And here actually you see several Indian cities, Mumbai, Delhi, in the top 10 as well. And the last category in terms of the results for prosperity, these from a benchmarking perspective again, whether those metrics were Fortune 500 headquarters, unemployment rates, GDP per capita, et cetera. You see a lot of Chinese cities in this list with Beijing and Shanghai at the top, followed by Tokyo. And then you have multiple other Chinese cities in here as well. Singapore ranks number 5th from a performance perspective. But again, when you asked in the survey, what cities do you think have the best job opportunities? Singapore is at the top of the list again, followed by Tokyo, Shanghai, and Seoul. So you get a slightly different list. You see some similarities, but some differences here. And again, when we combine those scores together, Singapore takes the number 1 ranking. So what does that mean in terms of overall? If we take those rankings, livability, lovability, prosperity, to come up with an overall score for our cities, these were the results for the 2025 first Asia Pacific rankings. Congratulations. Singapore's number 1 on this list, followed by Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong, and you work your way on down the list. And we'll have printed copies of the full report are going to be available for everyone to take outside during the networking reception. So you have all of the data highlighted within there. And what I think I just wanted to end on was looking and kind of breaking down so that this is essentially the scorecard for Singapore. So why is Singapore number 1? Well, actually, Singapore only ranked 28th from a livability perspective in terms of all of the various metrics, but its perception is number 1. Livability and lovability fairly aligned. Perception number 1, performance number 3, prosperity fairly well aligned with top 5 performance, but perceived to have the best job opportunities. I think one of the interesting things to kind of just take away from this data is obviously you can see perception of Singapore in number 1 across all 3 categories, that the brand of Singapore is very strong. And it's not even just by a slight margin. So when we do our world's best cities rankings, the differences between Paris, New York, London are quite slight. But here in the Asia Pacific region, we're not talking about 2 or 3% difference between first and second place. It's more like 10, 15%. So Singapore has a commanding presence amongst the minds of households throughout the Asia Pacific region as the best place to live, as the best place to visit, and as the best place for job opportunities. So this with it brings its own challenges as you think about the future for your city and the region of when you're number 1 or you're perceived to be the most desirable place. What kinds of pressures and demand will that create? How do you accommodate that? So there are these symptoms of success that we like to think about as it relates to accommodating that demand and thinking about what a future of a successful city looks like. Singapore doesn't need to work so much on brand or marketing, certainly needs to think about how does it sustain that success and deliver it in a more livable way, as knowing when we look at some of the areas that could be improved here. So with that, thanks for all of your attention. Copies of the report are available outside, and we'll look forward to discussing the results with you all in more detail and answering any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us at this very special CLC lecture today. And thank you WRLDCTY for launching the inaugural Asia Pacific Best City Report with us. Now we'd like a group photo with the speakers and the panel, and ED as well, EF.